We're going to hear one more time from Kurt Andersen, a novelist, magazine editor, radio host, talent extraordinaire, who's going to give us another way to think about the overall theme of the conference, that is, collaborate and connect. Kurt's recent novel, his very good novel, is called Heyday, and he's going to talk to us now about the heyday of collaborate and connect. I give you Kurt Andersen.
Happy to be back. You tell me what extraordinary era I'm describing. Everything is suddenly moving and changing discombobulatingly faster than ever. Globalization is accelerating. Wall Street is booming. Outside San Francisco, astounding fortunes are being made overnight by nobodies, plucky nobodies out of nothing. Miraculous new communications and imaging technologies have suddenly appeared, transforming business and everyday life. New media are proliferating, and they're scurrilous and partisan. Marketing spin and advertising are extending their influence as never before. A new working-class urban youth subculture has emerged. It's rude and stylish. It glorifies violence. It creates its own slang. It's finding its own new forms of entertainment. Christian conservatives are furiously battling cultural decadence, and one popular growing sect insists that the end days are nigh. Ferocious anti-immigration sentiment is on the rise. Both major political parties seem pathetically unable to deal with the looming urgent issue of the day, and one of those parties will wither away and die within the decade. The President of the United States has tapped into patriotic rage to invade a poor desert country, having dubiously claimed that the enemy nation represents a clear and present military danger to America. It is not the last decade, or not only the last decade, it is the 1840s. The novel that Jim mentioned that I published recently, Heyday, takes place between 1848 and 1850, and while doing research for it, I was repeatedly flabbergasted to discover how familiar that moment looks, looking back from the 21st century. History may not repeat itself, as a wise man once said, but it really does rhyme. I've become convinced that that moment in the middle of the 19th century, more than any other, is when modern American life really began. And we can see now that that is when the future, that is our present, really clicked into focus. The way we live now is the way that we started to live right then. Consider all the extraordinary things that had happened and were happening suddenly and all at once. During the 1840s, technology had jacked up the speed of daily life in several quantum leaps. Photography had just been invented in 1839, and so you had these unimaginably real depictions of reality produced by a little machine. And the miracle was in part a function of how fast it could do it. A picture as detailed as any drawing that took hours or days to make, but done in minutes. And which, unlike drawings, I think relevant to the moment we're experiencing now, it took very little skill to produce. Anybody could do it. The work of representing the world was democratized. All of the mechanical image making that followed that invention, motion pictures, TV, video, are essentially refinements of this original quantum shift. And the telegraph. Samuel Morse, who, by the way, had the first camera in America and was an art professor in New York before he became famous for what we know him for, perfected the telegraph, his version of the telegraph, in the early 1840s. And by 1848, just a few years later, the whole country was wired, electrically connected from Boston to New York to Washington to Chicago and New Orleans, the settled country at that point, as fast as any rollout of technologies that some of you have developed over the last few years. Imagine that in the middle of the 19th century. And again, as with photography, the shift was sudden and profound. For all of human history, messages took days or weeks or months on foot, by horse, on ship to travel. And then, like that, you had instantaneous communication. Travel was also suddenly becoming incredibly faster. Railroads, although they'd been in existence for 2 decades, reached their exponential hockey stick moment in the 1840s. And there was as we have seen in our lifetime, an entrepreneurial mania and something of a bubble. There was, though, a network effect that kicked in around 1848. 4 times as much railroad track was laid in the year 1848 as had been laid the previous year. And there was not yet consolidation, as we've seen in the last decade as our technology businesses have developed. You could take the train in 1848 across New York State from Albany to Buffalo, all the way, but you had to change trains 6 times and pay fares to 7 different lines. The same with the telegraph. There were lots and lots and lots of companies, and then over the next decade they began consolidating into a very few. And by the way, those train lines just in New York State, I don't know if you know this, ran on schedules geared to 4 different timekeeping schemes. Wherever the headquarters city of each railroad was the time that they followed. Today we take for granted synchronized 1-hour time zones as a kind of natural fact. But it was only after trains and the telegraph connected these distant cities and made time zones necessary that America's time zones were reduced from more than 100 to the 4 that we know today. And that took some time, which suggests that society takes time to adapt to new technology. In the 1840s, people were thrilled and frightened by what these new technologies were doing. A stock phrase at the time was about the annihilation of time and space. A writer at the time predicted, quote, that as distances are thus annihilated, the surface of our country would, as it were, shrivel in size until it became not much bigger than one immense city. Transatlantic steamship service started in the late 1840s, and then in 1849 from the East Coast to the West Coast. Trade and business were being transformed, internationalized, globalized, a word that did not yet exist. In Heyday, my novel, one of the main characters, who's a young Brit and has quit his father's textile firm, Knowles & Company, to emigrate to America and finally to California, acquires an Indian blanket there, a bayeta. Unbeknownst to him, quote, this very bayeta had started 6 years ago as Knowles & Company cloth, dyed with Mexican cochineal, then exported from Manchester to Bilbao, and then from Spain to Mexico, where a Navajo Indian had unraveled the cloth and rewove the threads into this blanket. The Navajo had traded several blankets to a Mexican for brandy, and the Mexican, now mining up in California, had in turn traded this one to a Maidu, one of the local Indians, for a pinch of gold, and then into my character's hands. What China is today, this rising industrial and trading power, money mad and reckless and cutting corners, wheeling and dealing, doing it on the cheap and as fast as possible, that was us then. As the University of Georgia historian Stephen Mihm calls it, it was adolescent capitalism. We were the adolescents in 1850 as China is today. America in the 1840s, for instance, was filled with pirated copies of British and European books, and American factories were producing counterfeit medicines, adulterated foods, chalk was put in milk, arsenic in candy, plaster in sugar and flour, coffee beans mixed in with dried peas mixed in with the bags of coffee beans to make the weight. It was also during the late 1840s, the same extraordinary moment that the archetypal American migration, the wagons of pioneers rolling into the West, began really in earnest, which was maybe one of our first great ad hoc collaborative social networks. What had been really an insignificant trickle in the early 40s, maybe dozens of people a year, increased 20 times in the middle of the decade, and then by another order of magnitude in the year 1849 alone. Just as that Western exodus reached full speed, American cities became real, bona fide, world-class metropolises for the first time. In 1800, New York had 60,000 people. It was the largest city, but by the middle of the century, it had grown to 500,000 in 50 years. Between 1840 and 1850, the sleepy, inconsequential little town of San Francisco turned into a big city almost literally overnight, the largest place west of Chicago, and modern California was born. San Francisco and modern California came to be thanks, of course, to the discovery of gold, which And that discovery, that accidental discovery, was just one of the amazing, transformative events that occurred in 1 month at the beginning of 1848. January 24th, gold discovered 150 miles northeast of here. 9 days later, the treaty was signed that ended the U.S. war with Mexico, which, by the way, was our first elective war, our first foreign invasion, our first war for empire. And thus, winning that war and signing that treaty, in one stroke, the United States was extended from the Texas border to the Pacific. At that same moment, this same amazing month in London, a 29-year-old German named Marx and his 27-year-old textile manufacturer pal, Engels, published a pamphlet that they called the Communist Manifesto. And a few days after that, still this same month, democratic revolutions broke out, first in Paris, successful in 3 days, and then across the continent. By the time the year was done, in 50 places across Europe. And the speed of that revolutionary wave in 1848 was hastened in no small measure by the fact of the telegraph, which could send the news of the success in Paris on to Milan and Vienna and so forth. Talk about connect and collaborate. But technology and the gold rush really comprised our second American Revolution, it seems to me, not political overthrow, clearly. The gold rush was this revolutionary ratification of the most wild and fantastical version of the American dream. The desire for instant fortune and for easy prosperity and extreme liberty bordering on and extending over into anarchy in California for the first few years after the gold rush. For the first time, think of this, ordinary people could, with hardly any capital and working in small collaborative groups or alone, could get rich. That was unprecedented. And in California, innovation and best practices spread with unprecedented speed. It was, I think, the first flash mob that ever existed in the world. That suddenly, when this news of the discovery of gold reached the East in the end of August of 1848, by September and October, ships were leaving Boston and Washington and New York to come here. And tens of thousands of people came during the next year. There were radically modern new modes of thought as well happening right at this moment. Charles Darwin was quietly constructing his theory of evolution, in part by connecting and collaborating, collecting data and samples of mollusks and other things from correspondence all over the world. In American politics, abolitionism, the idea that slavery should simply be abolished, was just beginning to move from being this freaky left-wing outlier of a position to the mainstream. Feminism officially launched in August of 1848 in upstate New York at this convention of reformers and talk about connecting and collaborating. They decided on the meeting on one day in August. 10 days later, the meeting existed, and they issued this shocking declaration that men had tyrannized women and that women should have the vote. Sudden technological progress plus suddenly large cities equals, among other things, modern media. As players in the digital revolution, you all know about Moore's law. Computers' microprocessing power doubles every 18 or 24 months. There was a comparable dynamic operating back then with steam power and the new rotary presses. During the first half of the 19th century, printing speed doubled every several years over and over and over again. Which meant many more and many cheaper newspapers with larger circulations. The invention of the modern magazine, Scientific American, Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, all started in this decade. And in 1846, a half a dozen of these new New York papers created a little cartel to take advantage of the new telegraph to collect news and called themselves the Associated Press. Nearly all the dailies then were partisan. The so-called sporting papers provided these lurid, low-down, gossipy coverage of celebrities and sex and crime. There were suddenly many, many more cheap books than ever before. There had been only 100 new books titles published in America in 1842. In 1855, it was 1,000. Modern marketing was being invented. The first national brands, the first department store, the first ad agencies, the first presidential campaigns in which marketers rebranded these upper-class candidates as rustic men of the people who had lived in log cabins. In 1848, of course, was the beginning of a golden age in American literature. Melville, Poe, Whitman, I could name more. One of those great young writers, Henry David Thoreau, who was really laying the groundwork for environmentalism as we know it today, was altogether disgusted by this new zeitgeist that he encountered and the new technology, so he went off to live in the woods alone. And he wrote in Walden, which he began in the late 1840s, "I delight to come to my bearings, not walk in procession with pomp and parade in a conspicuous place, not to live in this restless, nervous, bustling, trivial 19th century, but stand or sit thoughtfully while it goes by." What are men celebrating? Well, it seems to me they were celebrating more or less the awesome arrival of the new, of modernity, of connection and collaboration of an unprecedented kind. And they were thrilled and slightly terrified by the shock of the new, and they knew nothing better to do than to gather together at the Google Zeitgeist conferences of their time and celebrate. Here now, 160 years later, in this restless, bustling, trivial 21st century, some of us still are. Thank you very much.